World War II. Section 2. The Home Front.
If you were there. Shopping for food has become a whole new experience since the United States entered World War II. When your mother sends you to the grocery store these days, she gives you government-issued ration stamps. These stamps limit the amount of sugar, butter, and meat each family can buy. The sacrifice is difficult, but you know it will help the soldiers fighting overseas. In what other ways can you help the war effort?
Building background. As World War II raged in 1940 and 1941, the Allies relied on war supplies and food from the United States. President Roosevelt and Congress also increased defense spending at home, believing that the United States would soon join the fighting. The increased spending boosted the U.S. economy. Preparing for war. The United States was still experiencing the effects of the Great Depression when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The enormous effort of mobilizing for war finally brought the Depression to an end. Factories ran 24 hours a day, producing ships, tanks, jeeps, guns, and ammunition. Americans turned their knowledge of mass production toward the production of war supplies. One remarkable example was the building of Liberty ships, transport vessels for troops and supplies. Workers could build an entire 441-foot-long Liberty ship in as little as 4 days. American workers were soon doubling the war production of Germany, Japan, and all other Axis power countries combined. Unemployment fell to 1% in 1944. Agricultural production increased as well, as farmers sent food overseas to feed Allied soldiers. To organize the war effort, the government created the War Production Board, or WPB, to oversee the conversion of factories to war production. In 1942, for example, the WPB banned the production of cars so that auto plants could produce military equipment. The United States also needed millions of soldiers. Congress had begun to prepare for war by passing the Selective Training and Service Act in 1940. This was the first peacetime draft in the country's history. Men from the ages of 21 to 35, later 18 to 38, were required to register for the draft. More than 16 million Americans served during the war. To finance the war effort, the government increased taxes and sold war bonds. War bonds were essentially loans that people made to the government. People who bought war bonds in 1942, for example, would get their money back 10 years later with interest. Americans also contributed to the war effort by collecting scrap metal that could be used in weapons factories. People learned to adjust to government rations limiting the supply of gasoline, rubber, shoes, and some foods. Posters urged Americans to use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Wartime opportunities. You read that wartime production during World War I created new opportunities for many women and minorities. The same thing happened on an even larger scale during World War II. New roles for women. With so many men leaving home to fight in World War II, factories badly needed new workers. The government urged women to fill these positions. Women found themselves doing work that had traditionally been considered unladylike. One female riveter, a person who fastens parts on a machine, recalled her experiences building airplanes. I learned to use an electric drill, and I soon became an outstanding riveter. The war really created opportunities for women. It was the first time we got a chance to show that we could do a lot of things that only men had done before. Winona Espinosa, quoted in Ordinary Americans, edited by Linda Monk. Women also filled new roles in military service. About 300,000 women served in the armed forces through special divisions such as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or WAAC, and Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. WASP pilots flew test flights and ferried planes between factories and air bases. Army and Navy nurses served in combat areas. African Americans. The Great Migration that began during World War I continued as African Americans moved to northern cities to find factory jobs. In most cases, however, black workers received lower pay than did white workers. They also were restricted in what kinds of jobs they were hired to perform. To protest this unfair treatment, African American labor leader A. Philip Randolph began to organize a march to Washington, D.C. in 1941. If freedom and equality are not granted for the peoples of color, the war for democracy will not be won, he argued. Randolph canceled the march, however, after President Roosevelt issued an order prohibiting racial discrimination in the government and in companies producing war goods. About 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces during the war, mostly in segregated units. In the Navy, African Americans were assigned only to support positions and denied the right to participate in combat. Despite this, many black soldiers became national heroes during the war, including Dory Miller. Leaving his post as ship's cook, Miller manned a machine gun on the deck of the USS West Virginia until he was ordered to abandon the ship because it was sinking. The Tuskegee Airmen were African American pilots who trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. Benjamin O. Davis, who later became the first African American general in the U.S. Air Force, led the group. Davis and his pilots had to overcome prejudice in the military as well as the hazards of war. He later described the pilots as outstanding Americans who served their country unselfishly. Despite treatment that would have demoralized men of lesser strength and character, they persisted through humiliations and dangers to earn the respect of their fellows. The Tuskegee Airmen flew thousands of successful combat missions in North Africa and Italy. Mexican Americans. About 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the military during the war. Many Mexican Americans also found wartime jobs on the West Coast and in the Midwest. Because of a shortage of farm workers, the federal government asked Mexico to provide agricultural workers. The workers, called braceros, were guaranteed a minimum wage, food, shelter, and clean living conditions. About 200,000 Mexicans worked in the bracero program. Young Mexican Americans of the time created their own culture by blending different music styles and clothing styles. Some men wore zoot suits, fancy, loose-fitting outfits with oversized hats. Despite their aiding of the war effort, many faced discrimination. In Los Angeles in June 1943, groups of sailors attacked Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits, beginning the Zoot Suit Riots. During the 10-day period, white mobs attacked many Mexican Americans. Japanese American internment. Japanese Americans faced a different form of prejudice during World War II. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, some Americans began to look at Americans of Japanese descent with fear and suspicion. Most Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast at this time. It was feared that they would serve as secret agents for Japan and help Japan prepare an invasion of the West Coast or try to sabotage U.S. war efforts. The U.S. government had no evidence to support these fears. In spite of this fact, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order allowed the government to begin the process of internment, or forced relocation and imprisonment of Japanese Americans. About 115,000 Japanese Americans were evacuated from their homes and held in isolated internment camps. Half of those held in the camps were children. A smaller number of Americans of German and Italian ancestry were also held in internment camps during the war. At this time, some Japanese Americans were Issei, or immigrants born in Japan, but most were Nisei, American citizens born in the United States to Japanese immigrant parents. Whether they were U.S. citizens or not, Japanese Americans lost their jobs, homes, and belongings when they were forced to move to internment camps. A farm owner named Yuri Tataishi spoke of feeling betrayed by his government. "You hurt," he said. "You give up everything that you worked for that far, and I think everybody was at the point of just having gotten out of the Depression and was just getting on his feet. And then all that happens. You have to throw everything away." After the Pearl Harbor attack, the government banned young Japanese American men from serving in the military. But Roosevelt reversed this policy in 1943. Daniel Inouye remembered the excitement he and his fellow Japanese Americans in Hawaii felt when they heard that the government was going to form an all-Nisei combat team. An Army recruiter had prepared a pep talk for the young Japanese Americans, but this proved to be unnecessary. As soon as he said that we were now eligible to volunteer, that room exploded into a fury of yells and motion. We went bursting out of there and ran the 3 miles to the draft board, jostling for position like a bunch of marathoners gone berserk. Daniel Inouye, quoted in Only What We Could Carry, edited by Lawson Fusao Inada. Inouye was one of about 33,000 Nisei who served in World War II. The Japanese-American 100th, 442nd Regimental Combat Team received more than 18,000 decorations for bravery, more than any other unit of its size in U.S. military history. Many of the soldiers of the 100th, 442nd served while their families were held in internment camps back home. Summary and preview. The war effort changed life on the home front. In the next, you will learn about the fighting in Europe and North Africa. World War II. Section 3. War in Europe and North Africa.
If you were there. The year is 1943, and you are a senior in high school. You know that you will be drafted into the armed forces as soon as you graduate. Every day after school, you listen to radio reports about the battles being fought around the world. Your future, and the future of the whole world, seems so uncertain. How do you feel about fighting in this war?
Building background. By the time the United States entered the war, the Allies were in trouble. The Axis powers controlled much of Western Europe and were advancing in North Africa and the Soviet Union. German submarine attacks on Allied ships were making it difficult to get American supplies to the British. The Allies fight back. In December 1941, soon after the United States entered the war, President Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to work out a plan to defeat the Axis powers. Roosevelt agreed that the United States would place Europe first in its plans to defeat the Axis, while still aiding China in the fight against Japan in the Pacific. In addition, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed on 2 initial strategies: a buildup of troops in Great Britain to be used to invade France, and an assault on German forces in North Africa. Meanwhile, the Soviets had been demanding Allied help on the Eastern Front, where they had borne the brunt of the European war for months after Hitler's invasion. Stalin wanted the Allies to attack in Europe immediately, to take some of the pressure off of the Soviet forces in the East. In July 1942, however, the Allies decided to put a European invasion on hold and launch an initial offensive in North Africa. Stalin was angry. The Soviets would have to continue to fight the war on the Eastern Front without a Western European assault to distract the Germans. As they prepared their battle plans, the Allies faced many obstacles. One major threat the Allies had to combat was U-boat attacks. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank more than 6 million tons of Allied materials. To prevent further damage, the Allies used the convoy system of multiple ships traveling at once, along with new sonar technology. Sonar, which uses sound waves to detect objects underwater, helped Allied ships find and destroy German U-boats. In addition, new long-range Allied planes protected the convoys from the air. Long-range planes could also fly into German territory to drop bombs on factories, railroads, and cities, inflicting tremendous damage on German targets. Halting the German advance. Churchill predicted that the road to victory would be long and difficult. By winning several key battles, however, Allied forces finally stopped the German advance. North Africa and Italy. As you have read, a main focus for the Allies when the United States entered the war was North Africa. The Germans and British were battling for control there because Axis leaders wanted to grab control of the Suez Canal, a crucial supply route in Egypt. Germany's Africa Corps was led by General Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox for his bold surprise attacks. In the summer of 1942, Rommel began an offensive to take Egypt. General Bernard Montgomery led the British forces to stop the Germans. The British stopped the Africa Corps in July at the Battle of El Alamein. At the same time, U.S. and British troops, led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, came ashore in Morocco and Algeria, west of Egypt. Caught between two Allied forces, the Africa Corps surrendered in May 1943. With North Africa under their control, the Allies prepared to attack the Axis powers in Europe. Churchill identified Italy as the soft underbelly of the Axis. Allied forces invaded the island of Sicily in July 1943 and moved from there to the Italian mainland. Italian leaders overthrew Mussolini and surrendered to the Allies. But Hitler refused to recognize the Axis defeat. He sent German troops to Italy to block the Allied advance. In January 1944, Allied forces tried to get behind the Germans with a surprise attack at Anzio on the western coast of Italy. American and British troops landed at Anzio, but were pinned down on the beach for several months. The soft underbelly proved to be much tougher than expected. Finally, the Allied forces in southern Italy battled north to Anzio. The combined forces captured Rome, the capital of Italy, in June 1944. Early in 1945, German forces were driven out of Italy. Italian freedom fighters executed Mussolini. The Battle of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, massive German and Soviet armies were battling on the Eastern Front. By the middle of 1942, Axis armies had driven deep into Soviet territory. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. German forces then advanced to the key industrial city of Stalingrad. German firebombs set much of the city on fire. But Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was determined to hold on to Stalingrad at all costs. Savage street fighting dragged on for months. Soviet snipers used the ruined buildings to their advantage, firing at German soldiers from behind piles of stone and brick. German supplies began to run desperately low as the harsh Russian winter began. Hitler remained obsessed with capturing Stalingrad, however. He ordered his troops to keep fighting, though he did not send enough new supplies or soldiers. Thousands of Germans froze or starved to death. In late January 1943, the German commander at Stalingrad defied Hitler and surrendered to save his remaining troops. The Battle of Stalingrad thus became a key turning point of the war. The Soviet victory came at an enormous cost. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers died at Stalingrad. About 800,000 Axis soldiers were killed. After Stalingrad, the Soviets won another victory in the city of Kursk in the biggest tank battle ever fought. The Axis powers now began to retreat from the Soviet Union. The tide of the war in the East had turned. The D-Day invasion. After hard-fought victories in North Africa and Italy, the Allies were ready for an even tougher task: the invasion of German-occupied France. This was the first step toward the goal of liberating Europe and forcing Hitler to surrender. Dwight Eisenhower was in charge of planning what would be the largest sea-to-land invasion ever attempted. Eisenhower knew that German forces were expecting an invasion of France. The Germans had planted mines and stretched barbed wire along the French coastline. Heavily armed German soldiers waited on the beaches in bomb-proof bunkers. Eisenhower warned his troops of the danger, but expressed confidence in their ability to succeed. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you, he told them. American, British, and Canadian troops invaded France on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day or Designated Day. They crossed the choppy waters of the English Channel and landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. More than 6,000 ships, 11,000 planes, and 156,000 men were part of the invasion. Soldiers jumped from boats and waded ashore, often under heavy fire. The Americans landed on 2 beaches, codenamed Utah and Omaha. Fighting was especially fierce on Omaha Beach, where almost 3,000 men were killed or wounded. The entire beach was strewn with mines, wrote one U.S. soldier to his wife. With a stream of lead coming towards us, we were at the mercy of the Germans. By the end of D-Day, all 5 beaches were secured. The Allies then began driving east through French villages and countryside toward Germany. Summary preview. Allied victories led to the D-Day invasion. In the next section, you'll read about the Pacific War. World War II. Section 4. War in the Pacific.
If you were there. It is spring 1945, and your older brother is fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. You've been following the news reports closely. You know that fighting in the Pacific is terribly fierce. You hear that the Japanese soldiers often refuse to surrender, fighting to the death instead. Your brother reveals in his letters that he is lonely and suffering many hardships. Now you are writing to him. What would you say to encourage him?
Building background. Japan attacked China in the early 1930s, leading to all-out war between Japan and China in 1937. Japanese forces captured key Chinese cities, including Nanjing, where they killed up to 300,000 civilians. Under the command of General Hideki Tojo, Japanese forces continued to expand the Japanese Empire in Asia. Japan advances. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor left the U.S. Pacific Fleet so weakened that it could not immediately respond to the Japanese advance. While the United States recovered from Pearl Harbor, Japan conquered Thailand, Burma, the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore, and the U.S. territories of Guam and Wake Island. The same day as the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded Hong Kong. British, Canadian, and Indian forces attempting to stop the invasion were outnumbered. Japan attacked the American-controlled Philippines the same day. American and Filipino forces under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur could not stop Japan's advance in the Philippines. MacArthur left the islands in March 1942, vowing to return. More than 70,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. The exhausted soldiers were forced to march 63 miles up the Bataan Peninsula to prison camps. Many prisoners were starved and beaten by Japanese soldiers. More than 600 Americans and about 10,000 Filipinos died in the Bataan Death March. Key Allied victories. The Allies feared the Japanese might next attack India, Australia, or even the United States mainland. Admiral Chester Nimitz led the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was determined to stop the Japanese advance, and he had an important advantage: the ability to crack secret Japanese codes. American code breakers helped the Allies in two key naval battles in the Pacific. Nimitz learned that the Japanese were planning an attack on Port Moresby, New Guinea, an island just north of Australia. If the Japanese took New Guinea, they would have a base from which to invade Australia. In May 1942, Nimitz sent Allied forces to stop the Japanese fleet. American and Japanese aircraft carriers and fighter planes clashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Neither side won a clear victory, but the Japanese assault on Port Moresby was stopped. Allied leaders then learned that the Japanese planned a surprise attack on the Midway Islands. Nimitz was prepared. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942, when Japan started bombing the islands. American aircraft carriers launched their planes, catching the Japanese aircraft carriers while many of their planes were refueling on deck. American dive bombers destroyed 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, severely weakening Japanese naval power. Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged, said Nimitz. The Allies then began the enormous and difficult task of recapturing territory from Japan. In August 1942, American Marines invaded Guadalcanal, one of the Solomon Islands northeast of Australia. Intense fighting raged for nearly 6 months. Marine Luis Ortega remembered that enemy bombs and bullets were only part of the danger in the hot, rainy jungles of Guadalcanal. Soldiers also suffered from diseases, such as malaria, and from hunger due to lack of supplies. I had gone to Guadalcanal weighing about 150, Ortega said. I left weighing about 110. American forces finally took control of the island in February 1943. Battling toward Japan. Allied victories at Midway and Guadalcanal helped change the course of the war in the Pacific. The Allies now saw their chance to go on the offensive with the goal of reaching Japan itself. Island hopping. To fight their way toward Japan, Allied war planners developed a strategy called island hopping, where Allied forces took only the most strategically important islands instead of each Japanese-held island. They could use each captured island as a base for the next attack, while isolating the Japanese forces on the bypassed islands. Island hopping proved to be a successful strategy, though very costly to execute. Japanese forces fortified key islands and fought fiercely to hold on to them. In November 1943, U.S. Marines leapt off their boats and waded toward Tarawa, one of the Gilbert Islands. They advanced into ferocious fire from Japanese machine guns. The water seemed never clear of men, one Marine said. They kept falling, falling, falling. Both sides sustained heavy casualties at Tarawa, but the Marines captured the island. The Allies won similar victories in the Marshall, Mariana, Volcano, and Bonin Islands. In October 1944, General MacArthur led a mission to retake the Philippines. The Japanese Navy confronted the Allies at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The Allies crushed the Japanese fleet, crippling Japan's naval power for the remainder of the war. It also gave the Allies a base from which to attack the main shipping routes that supplied Japan. After splashing ashore on Leyte, MacArthur proudly declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Securing the Philippines took many more months of fighting. Allied forces and Filipino guerrillas finally drove out or captured all of the Japanese defenders by the summer of 1945. Final battles. With key islands close to Japan secured, Allied planes began bombing targets in Japan in November 1944. American B-29 bombers, able to carry 20,000 pounds of explosives each, led bombing raids on more than 60 major Japanese cities. A March 1945 raid set Japan's capital city of Tokyo on fire, leaving 1 million people homeless. Japanese factories were destroyed, and food became so scarce that many people neared starvation. Still, Japan refused to surrender. Two of the war's fiercest battles occurred on Japan's outer islands early in 1945. In February, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. Japanese defenders were dug into caves with orders to fight to the death. On Iwo, we hardly ever saw the enemy, recalled one Marine. After the Marines raised the American flag on Iwo Jima, a month of bloody fighting followed. Of more than 20,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, about 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest were killed or wounded in battle. Around 6,800 Americans had died. Beginning in April, an even deadlier battle was fought for the island of Okinawa. There were an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers on the island when U.S. forces began their attack. One U.S. Marine officer described the hard fighting at the Battle of Okinawa. "We poured a tremendous amount of metal in on those positions. It seemed nothing could possibly be living in that churning mass where the shells were falling and roaring, but when we next advanced, Japanese troops would still be there, and madder than ever." Colonel Wilbert S. Brown, quoted in The Final Campaign, Marines in the Victory on Okinawa, by Colonel Joseph H. Alexander. In the waters near the island, Japanese planes struck U.S. ships with the tactic of kamikaze, purposely crashing piloted planes into enemy ships. In wave after wave, kamikaze pilots flew planes loaded with explosives straight down onto the decks of Allied ships. An American sailor who was on the deck of an aircraft carrier when a kamikaze attacked the ship described the scene. "The plane cartwheeled the length of the carrier and plowed into the planes we had on the flight deck. We were burning bow to stern. All the guys manning the guns were dead, standing up, pointing their guns. They never left their posts." More than 2,500 kamikaze missions were flown, killing more than 4,000 Allied sailors. The fighting on Okinawa lasted nearly 3 months and led to terrible casualties. By the time the island was secure, some 12,000 Allied troops were dead and 36,000 wounded. The Japanese losses were staggering. Some 110,000 troops and 80,000 civilians had been killed. After their victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Allies were one step closer to final victory. Allied leaders began to plan for an all-out assault on the main Japanese islands. Summary and preview. The Allies made major gains in the Pacific War, moving closer to Japan. In the next section, you will learn how the Allies achieved full victory.